It feels so much nicer when you're singing with other people, and because when you sing with other people you're connecting on different levels. And my mom was a traditional singer from Littlewood, and she learned a lot and she passed on a lot of songs and knowledge to me. And yeah, one of the things with her is like sharing the culture and sharing the music, because there was a long time where we weren't allowed to share it, and so she felt it was necessary to keep sharing it. And like she always said, if you don't share it, you might as well put it in a museum and do nothing with it. Like, it's alive when it's being shared.
Well, it's kind of like where kids of the East Side come, like, it's for free actually, like they actually get experience to act, and like famous actors actually come and visit, they help out, and they get a good teach from good, like, really experienced actors and puppeteers and all that. It's really fun, and it's a good experience for kids and gets inspiring them.
Personally, my favorite part about Project Limelight is the fact that when you join, you feel like a family already, because you get to meet new people, and then everyone's nice, and you get to learn new things. It's if you have like a talent and you feel like you can't do anything with it, I think Project Limelight helps with that. I mean, it helps you embrace it and just bring it out, show the world like what you have.
Well, I can't really speak that much to other journalism schools, but one of the things about this one is how accessible it is to people in the community. It's free, it's very inclusive, we feel very welcomed here, and I know that Jackie's got a good background in writing for the community, working with Megaphone, so I trust her and I'm happy to learn from her.
We're now in our 4th year, and we're in our 9th class of community journalism. We do it every spring and fall, and it's a partnership between Megaphone magazine and the Van City Office of Community Engagement at SFU. It's just really important, I think, for people to be able to make space to do creative stuff in whatever form that is, and particularly creative work that communicates part of themselves to other people. And I think that in the downtown East Side community, that's particularly important, because not everybody feels like they get listened to or really understood a lot of the time, and any opportunity that makes that accessible for more folks, especially when the cost of living and the cost of going to school is so high, is really special.
Flamenco is really an art form of the people. It's a community-based art form. It really resonates, I think, for this community, because there is such a strong ethic of, relying on each other, and such a strong awareness around social justice, and really resisting sort of the oppressions that a lot of people in this neighborhood have faced and continue to face. So because flamenco evolved out of the subordination of many different cultures over a period of time in southern Spain, so there's some really interesting, I think, resonance between those themes in flamenco of suffering, but rising through suffering and finding community together and sort of celebrating those transformative qualities of life, and the downtown East Side and the kind of spirit of resilience and cultural pride here. I have students who are so committed. They've been coming for years and really have learned the art form and are beginning to be able to perform. So that's really exciting to have them join us on stage. And tonight was just a celebration of that whole community that's developed and the culture of flamenco and how it resonates with the downtown east side.
Good evening. And in the spirit of not only telling you, but showing you of the great programming that has occurred at SFU over across a number of campuses that we really are not only telling you, but showing you at what happens here at Simon Fraser University. I'm Andy Yan, and I'm the director of the City Program at Simon Fraser University. I would like to begin with the acknowledgement that this event is occurring on the unceded and traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. That the Gill Lecture is in the memory of Dr. Warren Gill. When you are entering tonight's lecture, the slides highlighted just a few transformative urban initiatives that Warren was a part of. Tonight is sponsored by the SFU Communities Trust, the SFU Office of External Relations, and the Van City Office of Community Engagement. And in particular, I'd like to acknowledge the help and the insight that Chandel Runka, Warren's partner, has given the programming team here. I never got to know Warren, and yet upon researching the works for his works for this lecture, so much of my personal and professional life, like so many others in this region and province, have been touched by him. Warren Gill dedicated his 33-year career to building SFU's reach and reputation, passed away far too young in September 2010. Warren held various administrative positions at SFU, including his final one as Vice President External Relations. A lifelong Vancouverite with a PhD in urban geography from the University of British Columbia, Warren joined SFU's geography department in 1977 and quickly became a champion for the creation of a downtown Vancouver campus. He played a key role and was intimately involved in all stages of its development. Under his stewardship, it grew from a small storefront on House Street. I believe the line was learn how to how, that on how, that he took from this small storefront to Harbor Center, and then to developing the Wass Center for Dialogue, the Seagull Graduate School of Business, and the SFU School for Contemporary Arts at Woodward's. Warren was also involved with the SFU's expansion to Surrey, of whom recently celebrated their 10th and 20th anniversaries respectively, that is with SFU Surrey and SFU Woodward's, as you saw by the video. In 1993 to 1994, he was chair of SFU City Program Advisory Committee, a program he helped found, thank you Warren, on which he served as a member from 1990 to 1994. He also served for several years with the City Program Steering Committee. Warren was also a director on board on the SFU Communities Trust in 2004. He was not only committed to SFU, but also to urban life in the city and region in which he lived and worked. He was a valued administrator as well as a popular geography teacher, a frequent media commenter on urban and transportation issues. Again, thank you for the influence, Warren. And a volunteer for a variety of organizations. Warren published academic papers on a variety of subjects, including the BC-Alaska cruise ship industry, transportation issues, and the Northwest Sound. So I guess we can learn about the Northwest Sound via the legacy of Warren. That for Warren's, the focus was broad, ranging from the nature of urban life and structure to the details of individual housing styles and options. He was passionate in engaging cities and neighborhoods he knew best in the Lower Mainland and metropolitan Vancouver. His pride of place was infectious, and his perspectives, not simply theoretical, but practical. He knew these issues were real and important, although affecting livability in his community. It was that practicality that was at the heart of his commitment and his focus as an academic, an administrator, as a teacher, and as a citizen. Never satisfied with the status quo, he worked constantly to improve it and thus make life in the city more interesting and inclusive. The intent of this lecture series is to continue Warren's questioning, to raise new ideas and invoke new ways of thinking about life in the urban context. In addition to this lecture, the Warren Gill Award for Community Impact recognizes staff and faculty members at SFU who have a similar impact working on issues that Warren did with communities in which SFU is embedded. Incidentally, as I was reminded that there is a open call now for the new Warren Gill Impact Awards nominations, and they're due December 9th. Tonight, we bring a special edition of the Warren Gill Lecture, a pivot from what is hopefully the latter days of the pandemic and a reflection of what Simon Fraser University, in its promise and its practice of university and community engagement, have done in Vancouver, Burnaby, and Surrey, in a lecture entitled Rethinking University Community Engagement. There is perhaps no less qualified individual to lead this conversation than our speaker tonight, Am Johal, for his quiet and consistent work and to build deep and reciprocal relationships between SFU and partners in Vancouver's urban core. Am was also the recipient of the 2020 Warren Gill Award for Community Impact. I won't read Am's full and lengthy biography, but he is the director of SFU's Van City Office of Community Engagement, as well as the co-director of SFU's Community Engaged Research Initiative, and the author of two books, Ecological Metapolitics and Global Warming and the Sweetness of Life, A Tarzan's Tale, co-authored with Matt Hearn and contributions from Joe Sacco. After Am's talk, he will be joined in a fireside chat with four other individuals deeply working on engagement and the university. Ginger Gosnell Myers, a fellow with the Center for Dialogue, Julia Oki, who is the executive director of Megaphone Magazine, Steve Dooley, executive director for the SFU Surrey campus, Sean Condon, executive director for 312 Main. And I'd like to pass the stage to Am. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andy, for the introduction. Thank you all for being here in person during this Snowmageddon, and all of you who are watching online as well. And I just want to also recognize being on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh peoples. My family comes from what is today Pakistan, and eventually went to India during the time of the partition. My father's family was born before. My father was born before partition, my mother after. And the long entanglements, if we look into all of our family histories, have some sort of relationship to colonialism and the arrival into this country. And I grew up in Williams Lake, territories of the Shwatmum people. And just to, as a university and as arts and cultural institution, the important work that's required ongoing in decolonizing practices and meaningful reconciliation. It's an honor to be asked to give this lecture, but I wanted to turn it into more of a dialogue. So I'm going to make some initial comments just to reflect on some of the work and learning that we've done here, and also questions that have come up from the time of doing community engagement. I see many of my colleagues here, both people that I work with at 312 community organizations, but also inside of SFU. That's so wonderful to see you in person. I didn't know Warren Gill, but as soon as I arrived to work at SFU in December of 2010, I heard amazing stories over the years from many, many people about his generosity of spirit, levity, and deep care about the role of a public university and its important place in city building. It's a real honor to be here on the shoulders of such a remarkable legacy of SFU and its history on Burnaby Mountain, but also the importance of its expansion here in Vancouver and, of course, Surrey as well. I wanted to engage in some storytelling and to take a more informal context, and I really, it was wonderful to speak with some people who knew Warren, and I want to thank Ann Cowan, who called me up one day, and she brought over a report that Warren had written around community engagement for the university before he passed away. We had a burger and a beer, and she downloaded about 30 years of SFU history in 90 minutes in the only way that Ann Cowan can. Also wanted to thank Chandel Runka and Gordon Harris as well, who spoke about the origins of the lecture series, and also Michael Stevenson, the former president of SFU, who shared some warm memories that, is no matter what the problem was, a good meal or a martini would make it better, couldn't make it better for Warren. So sounds like my kind of guy. In that spirit of generosity, I wanted to just share a few stories with you about the work we've tried to do here through SFU's Vancity Office of Community Engagement and SFU's Community Engaged Research Initiative, and finally some thoughts on the future of community engagement and some present entanglements, questions, and things that we're still working through. I'm going to start with sort of how I found myself here in this role to some degree, because I think it shapes a little bit of how I try to approach the work here. Back in 1998, a friend of mine, Alison Dunnett, and I were working on a community project called Humanities 101 through UBC, and it was modeled on a program from New York. There'd been an article written in Harper's Magazine that Alison had read, and we had spent some time on the student union there, and we thought it was an interesting sort of opportunity to try to build out a program that was a free liberal arts program with philosophy and arts. And in that process of meeting with community people like Ken Leotier, like Jim Green, many others, going to the Carnegie Center, seeing all of the kinds of critiques of universities that were out there in the community. But one of the things we found as well is that the university, although it had a public infrastructure, space, and libraries, for big areas of time, the classrooms were sitting empty, they weren't being used. And so through our relationships at the university, we worked out ways to book things for free. There was a lot of conversations around, this isn't really the policy, we can't really give out library cards, but don't tell anyone. So it was all like a little bit of policy breaking here and there. And of course, we called everything a pilot project so everyone could kind of do it once. And we kind of kept up that culture as we started at SFU. But one of the beautiful things about that program was that you could actually have these resources made available, that it doesn't cost a lot of money, that these are public institutions. There's a lot of goodwill to open up these spaces, but there still continue and remain barriers. And one of the things that people in the community said was that we couldn't start the program out at UBC, that it needed to start in the neighborhood to build community. So we were actually literally across the street from where Woodward's is right now, 112 West Hastings, the old Perel building where the Or Gallery was based. And one of the people who had wanted to teach in the program was Ken Lum, a wonderful Vancouver artist at the East Van Cross. And he had a long relationship with the Or Gallery. He put us in touch with Reed Shire, who's now a director at the Polygon Gallery in North Van, but at the time was at a small nonprofit artist-run center. And we had this beautiful space inside of an art gallery. We had professors who were ready to give up their time. We were reading Angela Davis speeches and Malcolm X. And we had a police officer from Seattle who had a PhD in philosophy, who did Plato's work. We had Bud Osborne as a guest speaker at that time. It was really beautiful moments. Clint Burnham is here, who at the time was a sessional instructor at UBC, went on to teach at Langara, and is now a full professor of English at SFU. So people here in the room remember that period. But in that time period, just the value that having access by trying to reduce barriers, never eliminating all of them, of course, that the value of a critical arts education can have for anybody. We also had great support from the Vancouver Art Gallery, from the Vancouver Opera. We were able to go see Tosca at the opera. Michael Ames as well at UBC's anthropology program, and Jim Green were teaching a course in the downtown east side. So we were actually able to bring our students from Humanities 101 out to the Museum of Anthropology to attend those classes. So you actually had undergraduate students inhabitants and residents of the neighborhood in communication. It was something really special about that moment. And once again, the rules and the policies didn't follow kind of what was happening in the community, but there was some transformative kind of aspects to that period. Later on, I went to work in government, and at that time, it was a very, very polarizing time. Just not that different than right now, related to the neighborhood. And I think that there are some really interesting aspects of the early stages of the Vancouver Agreement, in particular, where all three levels of government signed on: the health authority and the police as well. So 5 different bureaucracies that think about the neighborhood in different ways. It was imperfect. There were problems with it. There was a lot of people who weren't around the table. The local nations weren't at the table. There wasn't community level involvement that was on par with the levels of government. But in those stages, that's when the 4-pillar approach from Don McPherson was written. People like Nathan Edelson in the planning department. And also in the provincial government, there was a lot of leadership. We actually had a Ministry of Community Development, Cooperatives and Volunteers. But I think one of the lessons of that time period is that you had an NPA mayor like Philip Owen. You had an NDP government sort of in its dying days at that time, and a federal Liberal government. And people put their partisan hats off for a moment to think about, how do we look at public policy that can look beyond political horizons and political timelines, because of the kind of extra dedication that's needed to work together. And also to understand that when one government does one thing, another one does, they can be working at cross purposes with each other. And I think being in the room in that context was a really special time. When I talk back with colleagues, to be sitting in the room with the police who weren't in support of harm reduction, but eventually came around, there were some really beautiful things that happened. And being on the community consultation side in the provincial government, to go to meetings with business improvement associations who didn't want social services, or going to meetings of the Vancouver area network of drug users who felt like social policy wasn't moving fast enough as we were going through an overdose crisis, that everyone had to give a little around policy, and everybody did. And when I think about a really deeply polarized moment like we have right now, with different political contexts, but we have a new council in place, we have a new premier and council, and we have the institutional memory of how these things happened before, that we can update them to the present moment and hopefully try to move forward in ways that I think could be really interesting for the city, that capacity exists. And I really think SFU ought to play a role and be at the table as well, given our campuses downtown as well. I'm gonna sort of skip ahead a little bit and just speak a little bit to the work we've been doing here. And community engagement, I'm not going to go too far into an academic talk, but it's always definitions of what is community engagement. There is a Carnegie Community Foundation definition, but there's various ways that we can look at it. But if we think about it as a method that enhancing teaching, research, and learning through university community partnerships, that it works to deepen democratic practices. It's one of the ways in which post-secondary institutions can enhance their core mission, have impacts that result in greater benefits for all stakeholders. I'm going to move through just to speak a little bit about what we've tried to do here, because at the time when Woodward's opened, it was a deeply polarizing project linked to gentrification. We had all sorts of other controversies in place with art students moving into the neighborhood. We began to do some public programming, and the first thing that we did was, when Insight was in front of the Supreme Court, we had a request from Pivot Legal Society looking for space, and a lot of people were boycotting the building at the time. And Bud Osborne, a local poet, was here, and he read a couple of poems, and I still show those to students right now. But after 2 or 3 years of programming, we sort of retroactively put buckets to what we were actually doing. We didn't plan this ahead of time, but it felt right, and those things are broadly defined. Some of the events we've done over the years, Ginger is there, and this is the one that she helped organize and put together. We did great work with Kilsalem on Squamish language reclamation public events. Emma Talks was a great project that Carla Bergman ran here for a number of years, and Russell Wallace, until the pandemic hit, was doing monthly workshops, Lil Watt singing and drumming workshops. Megaphone, Julia's going to be on the panel as well, but we've been partnered for about 12 years with Megaphone on a community journalism program, but also podcasts and other programs. And one of the, I think, interesting things is just that if you can develop long-term partnerships, whenever issues arise around different mandates and missions, that you can actually work through them when you have that type of long-term relationship. And we're really happy to also be located at 312 Main with them as well. Karen Jameson Dance, who's an SFU graduate, professionally trained dancer, but also has a community practice with the Carnegie Dance Troupe, which ranges in age from mid-20s to the mid-80s. And so they're just performed here a couple of weeks ago at the Heart of the City Festival for about a decade. Many of you know Vanessa Richards, who also worked here prior to my time at Woodward's, and ran for about 10 years a community singers group in the Woodward social housing, who are neighbors just upstairs from the building. The Heart of the City Festival, of course. Binner's Project has a wonderful project around coffee cups that go into the landfill, and trying to get a deposit fee around them to get them out of the landfill. Hives for Humanity, wonderful group in the neighborhood. And one of the things they approached us about was that they had a really bad experience with a documentary filmmaker. And, when you sign the release forms, there's not a lot you can do afterwards in terms of how they use images. And so they approached us around, what can, even when the university comes down or a artist comes down, you kind of waive your rights when people take images. And so they wanted to look at ethics from a community point of view. So we were able to provide some resources where they created a set of values and programs. And it's been in peer-reviewed journals. There was as well a manifesto for ethical research in the downtown east side that was done in partner with. And so these have circulated internationally. They've been in journals. People from the neighborhood have gone and presented at conferences. And so I think it's really special when we speak with students here as well. We have the official sort of ethics policy from SFU, but we bring these documents in because then we think of ethics as a long-term ongoing project that we can continue to keep talking about. Kara Wells unfortunately passed away a few years ago, a theater professor, but we did a great project with a local downtown east side theater group along with third-year students. And we didn't know exactly how to get the proper approvals in place. And once again, it was a pilot project, but they worked over the course of an entire term and did a devised theater project as the close after 3 months. Project Limelight has been dormant since the pandemic, but this is a group based out of Strathcona Elementary School. But one of the great values of our students being able from SFU to work in a high production value theater context, working on costume design, working on lighting, all of those kinds of things. And having neighborhood parents as well from Strathcona filling up the Fay and Milton Wong Theater. So we would sell out on an afternoon and evening show just by making the space available. And we're looking to restart that again next year. 312 Main, I want to speak about this just a little bit. We have a couple of colleagues who are going to be joining as well. Many people have different stories about how this started because it takes a lot of people to figure out what to make a project of this size go. But this is, of course, the old police station at the corner of Main and Cordova. It's owned by the city of Vancouver. And the original plan as the police moved out was for it to become a tech center, and the Vancouver Economic Commission was working on that. And there was an alternative proposal. Originally, SFU was involved in it, but came out of the Van City Community Foundation around creating something different, something that was sort of modeled partially on the Center for Social Innovation in Toronto by co-locating nonprofit organizations that were being gentrified out of the neighborhood to give them affordable rent, but also the great work that Van City was doing at the University of Bologna in terms of social co-ops and cooperation, and also, what could the role of the university be inside that space. And we're still thinking this project through in many ways because we walked into the pandemic, but we've been in there since August of 2018 in our second floor space. And this is in January of 2020. I'll look at all those smiles before the pandemic, all the wide-eyed belief of what was going to happen there, but it still will. It's just taken a lot longer than we intended. Just going to move through some of this stuff so we can get to our conversation. And we've been doing a podcast for a number of years as well, which has been a great way during the pandemic to build international audiences as well. And it's been wonderful to be in conversation with people. Had a chance a couple of weeks ago to speak with Crenna Gore around climate change, and we've had dozens and dozens of guests, but also featuring our own professors, graduate students, and others in the work that they're doing. I'm going to bypass through all of this stuff so we can get to a conversation. This is. We always have to show the numbers to our funders and internal stakeholders, of course, so we have them. And I'm just going to briefly mention SFU's Community Engaged Research Initiative, which came out of the Vice President Research portfolio. And we've had some funding for a number of years to look at building a social infrastructure at SFU that supports a long history of community engaged research that goes right back to the beginnings of the university. But more recently, a recognition that this type of work with communities requires more time in relationship building. It requires a greater investment. And by providing small micro grants, by providing and recognizing the work of faculty members and graduate students through a graduate fellows program, that we can actually build up and hold up this work in a way that other universities do as well. And it's been wonderful to be in conversations with colleagues across the country. And what we're looking at in the next phase of this as we move forward is a research shop model as well, working with MyTax. We have somebody from MyTax here, and to look at where the community drives the research questions and figuring out ways that we can match faculty members and graduate students. In our initial phase, it wasn't sort of part of our mandate, but as we move forward, that's a clear identified way that we can support the work of the community organizations based out of 312 Main, but also outside of there as well. And so I'm just going to speak a couple of things around it, that community engagement is a method by which we enhance the impact of teaching, research, learning, and partnership building through reciprocity and long-term meaningful engagement around issues of public importance. And this ought to be a unifying project rather than a divisive one in a university, particularly coming out of a pandemic and facing multiple crises. New buildings don't build community on their own. It requires people and social relationships built over time. Critical citizenry is the greatest bulwark against anti-democratic forces. It doesn't just show up in cooperation and consensus, but through difference and dissensus and the messy part of how we work through conflict in complex ways. And to make durable public policy solutions, we'll have to, turn down the temperature on the rhetoric sometimes, and that the convening power of the university, particularly in polarizing times, to bring together community members, public policy practitioners, elected people, is a way that we can actually move things forward in a way, even if we can't come to consensus. While much good has been done in embedding community engagement more forcefully in the mission of universities, at its worst moments, community engagement can be window dressing in public relations. It can be a donor-driven institutional performance, virtue signaling, and displaying the irrational exuberance of the bloated claims it makes. And so are universities ready to give over power and share decision-making in a proper way? And in this moment, when we have a crisis of imagination, where the capacity to engage in public reason is on trial, where political polarizations reinforce these toxic cycles well into the future, where racial and economic injustice continue to fester, where climate emergencies place existential questions to the forefront about collective existence, the mission of universities needs to be made more rigorous, more public, more precise if times of crisis, and if they're able to play, if they're to play a role in city building and democratic life. And the kind of imagination, teaching, and research practices and institutional will that requires us to move beyond the usual practices and to invest in the social infrastructure that's necessary in building and modeling the future we want in partnership with communities. Community solidarity is not fixed in time and place. They're part of the material practices of the everyday. the university as a public institution has a fundamentally important role to play in collaboratively building the conditions for community solidarity. And the porousness of the institution, of how ideas come in and out of the institution, who they serve, the use of having to work around the policies of the university as well takes its toll for community partners as well as those working inside the system. And so how to invest in this work properly in a way that it can be durable over time. And to make community engagement into a real mobilizing force, it must be in real solidarity with community, with tangible resources available and given the time and the space for messiness and failure and taken out of our collective comfort zones. And in this place is where transformation can maybe emerge in unexpected places. And in an essay some time ago, Jeff Dirksen, who's the Dean of Graduate Studies. I don't think he's here today, but SFU is one of those unique places where our Dean of Graduate Studies is a Marxist poet. It's really lovely. He wrote that we're often reminded that we love the city, that intimate aspects of ourselves course through the veins of the city we live in, and that a deep affection binds us to the space and places of our city. And we do love our cities. Our lives are wrapped in and through spaces and textures and possibilities of our urban experience. Through the discussion of what is possible in a city, we slowly build up the city's identity and life. Today, there is indeed a desire for urgency and disruption and upheaval that the moment calls for. And coming out of the pandemic crisis, there's the opportunity to reaffirm, adjudicate, jettison old values, and expand the sphere of imagination within the everyday experiences of the city. This was certainly the case following the First World War and after the influenza pandemic of that time, again after the Great Depression and the Second World War. Entire neighborhoods in Vancouver were built with government investments. And this notion of, how high is the city, how deep is our love, how can we be together and how can we be in common in spite of difference? And if we can't be in common, how can we still live together alongside each other? What through difference binds people together in common beyond the shared geography of a given place? Architecture and urbanism can do many things, but the forms of democratic activation that bind communities together in solidarity is still relational work done by people. And the question of what is a public university's role in building community solidarity. University community engagement, when done well, is inherently pedagogical. The process has the capacity to teach us things and transform our worldviews. The community has much to teach the university. While the university has its own processes of rigor, the community also has its own processes of rigor and have their demands of how work is to be done. And sometimes those two places don't meet in the same place. And so we need to allow room for how to do that work better. Our commitment to solidarity, participation, and engagement come out of a necessity to meet what is a mission of a public university. We can't do this work just to generate knowledge that passively gathers dust on bookshelves. As important as that may be, we must commit to a more radical democratic porousness of the university that lets ideas move in and out seamlessly to begin to scratch the surface of the many crises before us. In that sense, the work of community engagement will never be finished at SFU, but will need to be constantly reformed, rejuvenated, reimagined. We must be simultaneously deeply local and global because of the complex, interdependent world we live in. We need to move towards the tension and the crises rather than away from them. We have an obligation to do more as public institutions, particularly SFU with its unique history. And so this question before us, I'm going to ask my friends to join us on stage is, in a time of climate emergencies, racial injustice, social and economic inequality, and multiple crises, what is possible in community engagement today, and what can a tangible and relevant agenda for university community engagement look like? As the original 1965 faculty member, Jerry Zaslav, who passed away last year, often asks, what kind of university do we want? So I'm going to leave it there. I'm going to ask you all to join me here. Thank you. Thank you all so much for joining us. I'm going to start with you introducing yourselves a little bit, and also to talk about your own work at the intersection of university and community, what you find rewarding about it, but also where more could be done. Why don't we start with you, Ginger?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I'm at an interesting place in the university because I'm not an academic. I'm a fellow at the WASC Center for Dialogue. And so we're really situated to interrogate a lot of issues by bringing people together, something that doesn't happen often enough. And my focus is on Indigenous peoples in cities and Indigenous communities in cities, and how we can look at bringing Indigenous knowledge into city building. And it sounds easy enough. It really isn't, because it hasn't been done here in the city, and it hasn't been done very much around the world. But I will leave you with something to think about, just to compare what it is that I'm trying to achieve with the work that I'm doing. When we visit other countries and we revel in the beauty of the culture and the architecture and the space, and how the people there come together as families and communities, that is the type of cultural cohesion rooted in those lands and those languages that we need here, because we're on the fast track to a very bad place with the climate emergency that we're in right now. And I truly believe that Indigenous knowledge in city building, looking at values, looking at principles, looking at practices, is the way that we can combat and balance out a lot of the issues that we see. And I'll talk about that a little bit more later on. That's just a bit of a taste of what I'm doing. Thanks.
Thank you, Ginger. Sean?
Thanks, Sam. Yeah, so I think as a managing director at 312 Main, you know, it's represented by its own institution and connected to other institutions that have equal challenges and barriers and desires to engage as well. Being a financial institution with Van City, working in a building that is owned by the city of Vancouver, that was the former Vancouver Police Department headquarters, that hosts Simon Fraser University. And within that, though, there are a number of artists, entrepreneurs, social enterprises, community groups, social service groups, activists. And so it's a really unique opportunity still to coalesce, connect, and see what can be built. Similar to, I think, what you're saying, Ginger, it feels like a very desperate time right now. Certainly in the downtown east side, things are incredibly challenging, as they've always been, but there's a new level of pain that has surfaced up in the last 5-6 years through the overdose crisis, and the last 2-3 years through the COVID health crisis as well. And a lot of the community leaders have passed away in the neighborhood. So unfortunately, there's a real loss of voices and leadership in the neighborhood as well. And so people are at capacity. You know, they're just drowning in the struggle of maintaining organizations, maintaining relationships. And yet within all that, it's remarkable that there is still so much passion, so much energy for creating change. People that bring so much love to their work and to the community. So at 312 Main, as a Center for Social and Economic Innovation, as a hub, as a community center space, you know, it is a real exciting opportunity to say, how can we share the space, but how can we share the burden here of collectively creating that change? And so that's what we're working on there. Yeah.
Thanks, Sean. Julia?
Yeah, so you saw a little bit of what we do at Megaphone in Am's presentation. If you are already familiar with Megaphone, you're probably more familiar with our vendor program. We work with people who have been excluded from traditional forms of employment to train them as vendors and sell a number of print products, Megaphone Magazine, Hope and Shadows calendar. We do a literary anthology as well. They buy them at cost, they sell them for an income, and so that's kind of the core of what we do. Folks were probably less familiar with the work that Am spoke about, these other sort of wraparound programs that we do to support people to produce content that goes into those publications. So we do workshops, mentorships. We do one-off projects like the podcast that we did together. And those come through a number of partnerships with universities, with artists, cultural practitioners, journalists. And, with a range of success, we've had a number of really productive university partnerships. And I'm not just trying to butter you up, but it truly has been, and from what I've seen, a very productive partnership, one that's worked very well for Megaphone. The Voices of the Street launch event and Community Journalism 101. And I would put that kind of broadly in a bucket of a partnership where it sounds as though in the origins it was truly a kind of collaborative project, but in the end it really is driven by Megaphone, directed by Megaphone staff. The programs itself informed by Megaphone staff with consultation from the community. So that's one where we have real ownership over the project, and it means that we can be quite responsive to the community and what we do. We've had a number of others that have been quite interesting. We are in our second year of partnership with Langara College. We're calling this the Community Journalism Mentorship. So two peer storytellers get to receive training from a Megaphone journalist and our managing editor, Paula Carlson, for a number of months to learn how to do work on assignment, to write on assignment for the magazine. And once they receive some of that training, then they go to Langara College in the fall for the Fundamentals of Journalism course. And it's been an incredible partnership. There's the two that completed last year continue to write for Megaphone. They've been able to write for other publications like the Tyee. That's something that I would put in the kind of bucket of, we were really informing how that work was happening at Langara as well. So we could fundraise for additional wraparound supports. There's a tutor from the UBC Learning Exchange. We can provide, forms of accessibility, and they're paid for the entire process, which is incredibly important. However, there have been other forms of projects that maybe I'll save for other parts of the conversation where it can be a little bit more challenging. But yeah, I'll leave it.
Thanks, Julia. Of course, Steve always, whenever we're talking about Vancouver for too long, he's always like, what about Surrey?
What about Surrey? So Surrey campus, we just celebrated our 20th anniversary. Big shout out to Dr. Joanne Curry, our VP External Relations, who basically started the campus. And if you don't know anything about Surrey, first thing to know, it never rains there. Never rains at all. It's a beautiful place. I think I'll kind of try and show up in my role as executive director. And when I think of community engagement, the first thing that comes to mind for me is showing up. It's showing up in the community, being part of the community without any expectations of benefit for SFU. So as an example of that, I co-chair the City of Surrey's Poverty Reduction Coalition. I've been the co-chair of the Social Innovation Summits we've done in partnership with the city. I'm a member of the Local Immigration Partnership Table. And it's not just about me. There are others of us who show up. Somebody in your video mentioned the word trust. And it really is all about building that authentic. And by the way, once you get to know me, authentic is my favorite word. How do you know when a relationship is really authentic? And a couple of quick examples in terms of, what really excites me about some of the work we've done. I'm also heavily involved in community engaged research. And one of the themes in community engaged research is the process is the outcome. Yes, outcomes are really important, but how you get there sometimes is as important or more important than what the actual outcome is. So as an example, we hosted C2 Expo 2017, and I'm thinking, and I was the co-chair of that, I'm thinking, okay, we're going to put on this huge international conference. How does it benefit community? So what we did is we developed something called the Community Ambassadors Program. Binners was very heavily involved in it. The Ambassadors Program, we hired 60 people with barriers to employment from all walks of life to work at the conference in meaningful jobs. And when I say meaningful, I mean meaningful. We had photographers, we had hosts, we had people facilitating events. And I can remember actually a couple of stories. There was one person that we hired for the conference who was actually banned from SFU because of something else that had happened. They were there. They were a full member of what we were doing at the conference. Another one of our persons, Craig, had developmental delay issues. He came to our conference. He went on to become a professional clown. And as recently as last month, he worked at an SFU event as a professional clown. So just things like that, building community capacity as you deliver. Another program I'm so proud of is our Envision Financial Community Leaders Igniting Change. It's regular folks from the community who otherwise would not have access to the university, but they have an interest in changing their community. So this is a leadership program developed by one of our amazing BD School of Business profs, who if you took this course as a private person, it'd be like $10,000 or something. But it's an amazing leadership program for the community, for these individuals, many of whom would never be on SFU space. So it's an invitation into the community. And I think where we're going, Amy asked to comment on that, maybe we talk further about this, is when I think of social infrastructure, I think of social infrastructure of how do we engage by building stuff, or when we build stuff. So it was just announced the other day, we're going to have this new medical school at the Surrey campus, but it's not just building the school. It's still, for me, the process is the outcome. How do you get to the actual building of whatever it is you're going to build that is community engaged, that involves the backshop of the university, facilities people, other people within the university? SFU is leading around social procurement. So there are kind of really good things happening, but I think we really need to think about like a program like Embers that supports people coming out of addiction to work in construction. Is there a way for us to require in our RFP for spending millions of dollars on stuff to build stuff? Is there a way that we can leverage that building of stuff to support community? And that's sort of where I'm kind of going in my own thinking about engagement.
Yeah, one of the things I was going to mention as well is that in the process of various partnerships that we do, one of the great benefits is the sort of pedagogical value of most of the people that have worked in our office are students who are either finishing their undergraduate degree or have recently completed it. Many of them are here tonight. Melissa Roach, who worked for a number of years in communications, Andrea Creamer, who worked in the office, went off to do a master's degree, Samad Jaffer, who's doing her PhD at Yale right now. I think if you were to speak to all of them, they speak about the classroom experience of what they had at SFU, but in working in the various community engagement offices, to work directly with community partners has been something that's really distinctive about SFU, that's really valuable about the student experience. So the next question I was going to ask you was just around this moment of coming out of a pandemic, climate emergencies, racial injustice, the need to move through decolonizing practices in a place like a university that has been historically really challenged or connected to colonialism in terms of our education systems broadly. What can a tangible, relevant agenda for community engagement look like? There's some things that we do right now, but it seems like the crises are so vast and deep that we're barely scratching at the surface of what we need to do. So,
yeah, well, I guess I have another question to add on to that is, what would a university look like if it decided it was going to advocate for the issues instead of study it? And I feel like at this point in the many emergencies that we're facing, it feels like the time for studying needs to come to a crux at some point. And I look at the economy of scale that all universities have, but especially SFU and its prominence in the city here, and how that economy of scale could be mobilized for actual change. And I'll give you an example. I'm working on urban indigenous planning and decolonization. And I have many reasons why this is needed, and it's great, and I can talk about the great projects that I'm working on. But I'm also doing this in isolation. I also know that there are others in the university who are working in this area, but there's nothing that would bring us together, right? There aren't any hubs that will bring us together to mobilize us. And contain the information that we are gathering and help strategize for how this can actually be useful for both community members and decision makers. Because without that, we're just making things up in isolation from one another. And that's not the type of community that we really want to be. And so a community engaged university needs to walk the talk. And I also want to let you know one of the teachings that I have gotten from the Squamish Nation is the teaching of Chen Chen Sui. And Chen Chen Sui is a Squamish word for lifting each other up, right? Lifting each other up. So how can we mobilize around issues more effectively? And Chen Chen Sui, have the university lift us up so that we're not in isolation, because the pandemic has taught us that's actually going to do more harm than good.
Thanks, Ginger. Sean?
I think we're gonna go just in order. Yeah, that's great. Yeah. I mean, it feels daunting and challenging, and yet I also feel like the blueprints have been drawn up. You know, I think communities have been crying for the action for so long. They've laid it out for folks with power to follow through. And so while it can feel complicated in this very stressful time, it also feels like there's some very tangible action items that can be picked up and delivered upon. And it feels also kind of, there's a patronizing element sometimes to like, how are we going to wrap our heads around this? And folks for so long have done the work. They've done the hard work to make calls for action. So I think, it's a huge institutions, not just universities, but have so much power, has so much resources, so much capacity that, is really just a matter of how can they show up and distribute that power and share that power. And I think that's, following those calls of action, but also sharing that power. And I think that's maybe where the barriers have been, is a real sense of, okay, how can we sit down with community, listen and work with community, but we're just not quite ready to, open up and pass power back to community. And I just don't see how how we're going to actualize that change without that happening. So, that takes, as has been said, trust. It takes time. It takes energy. It can be messy. It's complicated. There's missteps. But it can be done. And it's just, it really takes that just constantly showing up and that intentionality. So I think I remain hopeful, because I think it's there. I think, I think there's solutions that are quite tangible, that we just need the resources and capacities, and we just need to show that we're determined to make that change.
Julia?
I think there's a common thread here. And I was actually thinking, as you're asking the question about what you had said earlier about, I think something about rigor coming up against need or something to that effect. And that's somewhere that I think we could go, is just dispensing perhaps with some of the notions of rigor and that tends to be embedded in academic work. The kind of constant need to professionalize and build your CV and write to the academic journal. Not that we should do without peer-reviewed work, but it does seem to get in the way. And I think there's a lot of possibility for just kind of cracking open what it means to do academic research, what it means to produce knowledge, what it means to distribute, circulate knowledge. Like, I think that can happen in a lot of different spaces, and it can happen very creatively. I was thinking about a project that we did recently at Megaphone with someone from UVic and from UBC. They're both journalists, and they came to us with the climate disaster project, they called it. And they wanted to work with people who have maybe most acutely experienced some of the more extreme weather events that we've had recently. So the heat dome, the atmospheric river event, to develop sort of human interest stories that could be put into a sort of online repository, and along with some scientific work on climate change, and get sort of circulated, distributed to smaller media outfits that couldn't really afford to do that work themselves. And they came to us with, they had the language of trauma-informed journalism, and we thought that was really great. But what really made it work was they took the time to listen to us and talk to us about what that actually would mean in the context of working with some of the peers in the Megaphone community. So it ended up, a lot of it does come down to money. They could provide a certain amount, but we were really interested, so we fundraised for the additional funding so that we could slow down the process quite a bit. There were kind of levels of interview, review, it would happen at times that some of the people participating just would not be available, but we would still continue to work with them, slow it down. And students were traveling from Victoria, and on a semester timeline. There's these kind of aspects of the work that still, are necessarily rigid in a way that we'd prefer them not to be. But it's, I think, ended up working quite nicely. And there's some stories that I don't think that would be told otherwise about the heat dome, for example. I mean, what was it like for someone in an SRO with a broken elevator during the heat dome? I think that's an incredibly important story to tell, or someone who ends up having, a heart condition. And, people who are also doing community work, serving their, fellow community members through that. That's incredibly powerful, and I think really necessary work. So like doing away with notions of objectivity or rigor, or the sort of notions of authorship as well. Like if we could just somehow displace the academic ego, I think that would be really helpful.
Thanks, Steve.
I'll come around to the climate part of the question, but I did want to start by saying that Surrey, I'm going to talk about Surrey, now has the highest proportion of urban Indigenous people in the province, and there is no urban or Indigenous gathering space anywhere in the city. Nowhere in the city. And so that's why when I talked earlier about the social infrastructure piece, that's probably going to be my hill to die on, is to try and make sure when we do expand that it includes Indigenous gathering space for this community, with the community. I think one of the things around the question in the work that I've been doing in building my own personal knowledge about working with Indigenous communities is this notion of living in two worlds, and the trickiness of that, being in a position where you have budgets and so forth and timing, and things have to be done according to a certain plan. Not to say that Indigenous groups don't have planning as well, but just kind of thinking about the time it takes to build the relationships in an authentic way, not trying to rush things through, demonstrating that you are there with and for as an ally with the community is a huge piece of it. So for me, and the other thing I do want to say, we can't lay blame always at the foot of the university. The university is part of a system. We're funded by other people, by the province, by other organizations, and sometimes we're kind of we're stuck based on what funding requirements are. I know, for example, when we did our second building at the Surrey campus, the province said, "Oh, you're building an engineering building. You'll have 4 of these and 5 of those and 7 of those and this many washrooms." There wasn't real room in the negotiation to think about some of the other things that were needed at the community level. So I think that has to be part of the conversation, not just the university, but the funders. And putting on my hat as a co-chair of Community-Based Research Canada, there is things happening where funding is going directly to community. Not enough, but it's coming. And it's coming in a really big way where the community will get the research dollars, and then it will then, they'll find their own partners. Might be university, might not, but kind of thinking about that. as well. And around climate change specifically, I wonder about the extent to which engagement needs to or will go to an activist kind of perspective, like really supporting. I think young people today are saying enough is enough. When are we actually going to do things to meet the climate crisis? Because we're all sort of feeling it as well. And I'm wondering to the extent that that's going to lead to much more activism, and how will the university show up in that space? I know that I have a colleague at KPU in the crim department. For his engagement in his class, he requires students to engage in civil disobedience as part of the course. I mean, it's really interesting, how much of that, what are some of the issues around liability with that for the university? There's all those kinds of questions that need to be addressed going forward.
And yeah, I agree with you on the sentiment that I think that we can be too careful and risk averse inside of institutions. I think when I first came in here, more on the community side, I had a lot more fire and brimstone in the beginning stages of moving through and getting into arguments inside the university. And I think that we need to take bigger risks. And in January, Wendy Peterson, a longtime neighborhood organizer, is going to be our first activist in residence in Community Engaged Research Initiative. Yeah, exactly. And the Carnegie Community Action Project, where they've been doing community-based research for a long time with or without university partners. And we need to find a way to recognize that and bring resources to the table. We've got great people like Nick Blomley and others who've had a long history in the neighborhood, but we need to elevate and build that big, because the community has a lot to teach the university. At the end of the day, we're getting close to the end of time, but there is going to be a reception in the World Arts Center right after this. So I'm just going to ask if each of you have just a minute to close with some closing thoughts.
Universities need to continue to provide this evidence for a lot of the things that are happening today, and have a responsibility to be both truthful and have, like, I agree, like some degree of rigor, but not enough that it holds people back from being involved. So, with that, I really do imagine, like, what would a university that threw all its might behind a few key issues like urbanism or climate change, like, what impact could this really make? I think that's really exciting. I think that would attract a lot of students. And we already have a lot of incredible thinkers, right? So we have a lot going for us. We have the infrastructure in place, and we have more to come. So how can we build on that and have that impact that we truly need? I think we're very close.
Thanks, Cinder.
I mean, if I could just close the story about you, Am, just how, we started working together. So back before, when I was the executive director of Megaphone, Am, and just talking about Woodward's, how it first started and some of the controversies, you'd often see Am whipping up and down Hastings Street, and you're like 12 feet tall, so you're not, everyone sees you. And one day I came out of the office on Hastings, and Am just started engaging with me and said, what can we do together? Woodward's is this opening. Megaphone, we're doing writing workshops, and it was quickly like, let's do this community journalism project. And Am was like, we'll do it, and I'm like, okay, sure. And that's awesome. And it was, I think, really, that I think only happened because we met on the street and you putting yourself out there into the community. And so even as, universities can move into the city, you can still get tied behind the walls. So coming out to where people are at, meeting them where they're at, and creating solutions, programs, whatever it is with them, is the only way that that's going to create, I think, real change that is going to work with community. So I just don't think that would have happened if you weren't outside. We couldn't have done that that idea and that program. So I think that's part of that spirit, and that's what you've done and brought to SFU into this the downtown east side and the community. And I think that needs to be replicated.
I was kind of hoping something brilliant would come to me, but I don't actually. I would like to co-sign this idea of the inversion of the flow of funding. That sounds brilliant to me. And then I'll just otherwise say that Megaphone The December magazine includes 2 sheets of wrapping paper for $2. So please go find a vendor. You'll get 2 sheets of wrapping paper with a magazine for $2, but you can always tip.
Thanks, Steve. Good job.
Well, first of all, I want to thank Anne and everybody for inviting somebody from the Surrey campus to come out and talk about all the cool things happening at Surrey. But jokes aside, these are difficult times. Like within the boundary of city center, if you go to City Hall across the street from 104th, there is a kind of a grassy area through there. When I give a tour of the Surrey campus, I say, oh, look at all these beautiful things happening. But if we went into that field, we'd find thousands of used needles. And, that's right within our community boundary. And what responsibility do you have to support those who are the less fortunate in our community? But I do want to finish on a really kind of positive note. I'm really, really supportive of our new president, not new so much anymore, Joy Johnson. Her priorities around EDI, reconciliation, I believe they are really authentic. And I think we are already seeing some shifts towards kind of doing this in a real and meaningful way at SFU. So thanks for having me, Vancouver.
Thank you so much, Steve, Julia, Sean, Ginger, for joining me. Thank you for the invitation, Andy, and thank you all for being here. For those of you online, we're going to say goodbye for now. But for those of you here, please join us at the reception in the World Arts Center in the second floor here. Thank you.